South Africa's political left is on the brink of collapse. Here's why. For those of you who followed the 2024 election, it seems pretty clear that the ANC and other like-minded parties such as EFF and MK still dominate South African politics. After all, they all got over 63% of the vote collectively. Still, if we analyze the data beneath the results, we find out a pretty interesting trend that proves just why the political left is about to collapse. But before we continue, could I please remind you to subscribe to the channel? It's completely free, and all you have to do is hit that subscribe button in the bottom left corner of this video. Now let's get started. So I'd like to start off by showing you this spreadsheet that I've created, which tracks the voting results of the RET faction from 1994 until last year's election. Now, for those who might not be aware, the RET faction stands for Radical Economic Transformation. These are the sorts of parties, much like the ANC, who are looking to implement socialist and even communist-style policies. And so, while some people argue about whether or not the ANC really is an RET party, and there are many people who will say, well, the Cyril Ramaphosa faction is more moderate than other factions, I tend to disagree. After all, we've seen how the ANC under Ramaphosa has pushed through policies such as EWC and NHI, and so I tend to believe that they are in fact an RET party, much like the EFF and MK. Now, onto the analysis. So, as you can see, I've created a line chart which tracks the total number of voters that these such parties have attracted over time. So just to break it down, in 1994, there were two main RET parties. It was the ANC under Nelson Mandela and then Robert Sobukwe's PAC. This was also quite a militant-style party, quite similar to the EFF, and so I've included them in this analysis. In 1999, I included the ANC along with UDM of Bantu Holomisa. So the UDM was actually the first ANC breakaway party, and they did fairly well in their initial election, hence why I've included them in this analysis. Moving on to 2004, and we saw the ANC under Thabo Mbeki. Now, it is important to note that in 2004, it made sense for the ANC to rise in support, as well as in 2009. And a very large reason for this is because Thabo Mbeki did a big job at moderating the party, and the country was doing very well economically under the ANC at this time, with GDP rising above 5%. And so it made sense that certain moderate voters would have been attracted to the ANC, hence why they had a surge in support. And we actually see this in the percentage of vote. I mean, in 2004, the ANC combined with the UDM amounted to 71.97% of the electorate. In 2009, I only included the ANC in the RET faction simply because at that time, the UDM had already lost support drastically and was thus a statistically insignificant party. We also had the creation of COPE, another ANC breakaway. However, COPE was very much a center-left, more pro-market party, and so it wouldn't really seem fair to include them as an RET party. It would be suitable to include them among the likes of the DA, who are more centrist and market-friendly. Moving on to 2014, and we saw the creation of the EFF. Of course, this, together with the ANC, forms part of the RET vote. We saw these two parties again in 2019, and then fast forward to 2024, we saw the creation of the MK party. And so at this moment in time, our RET faction consists of the ANC, MK, and the EFF. Now, if we take a look at this line graph, we see that there's been quite a lot of fluctuation. So at the time when Thabo Mbeki was in charge of the ANC, we saw the RET bloc receive more votes. And then from 2014 up until 2024, we've seen a constant downward decline. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, Matthew, this isn't exactly proof that this block is actually eroding. But the next graph that I'm about to show you proves my point. On this spreadsheet, we've taken the data from the previous spreadsheet and measured it next to registered voters. So if we take a look from 1999 up until 2024, we see for a fact that while registered voters in South Africa have been on a constant increase, the RET block of voters remains stagnant. This becomes more clear when we take a look at this column that I've included, which measures the percentage of registered voters who are part of the RET voter block. So in 1994, we didn't have any data on the amount of registered voters in the country, so that year had to be excluded. However, from 1999 until 2024, in every single election without fail, the RET block has become an increasingly smaller proportion of the total number of registered voters in the country. And unfortunately, this proves to us that while more and more voters are becoming disenfranchised with the ANC and its counterparts, rather than voting for other parties, they've decided to opt out of the system. Now, although an increasing number of voters are opting out of the system, centrist to centre-right parties actually have a better chance than ever to defeat the leftist political parties in South Africa. And there are two reasons why. The first reason why this is possible is because of the racial breakdown of political party support. So if we take a look at this graph provided by the Social Research Foundation after the 2024 election, we see that the ANC and its counterparts won the majority of black votes. So the ANC had 53% of black support, followed by the MK at 17% and the EFF at 14%. This equates to 84% of all black voters. The opposite, however, is true when it comes to minority voters. So, we see that 62% of colored people voted for the DA, after which they voted 13% for the PA. And this shows that the vast majority of colored people vote for center to right-wing parties. Interestingly enough, around 7% of colored people voted for the ANC. But why we can be pretty certain that this percentage is dropping is because in recent by-elections, the PA has been biting into the ANC's voter base like never before, particularly in colored areas. If you'd like to see more on this, please be sure to check out my recent by-election video, the link to which is above. We can then see that Indian voters overwhelmingly voted for the DA at 63%. Again, this was actually followed by 10% of Indian voters going to the ANC. And then in third place, we saw Action SA with 6% of the Indian vote. And so again, it's another racial group that has gravitated more towards the centrist to right-leaning parties. Amongst white voters, 75% voted for the DA, followed by 4% for Action SA. We then saw about 2% voting for the ANC, which is pretty curious, but what we do also need to remember is that certain other parties were not included in this poll. So, for example, the Freedom Front Plus generally pulls its support from white and colored voters, and so they haven't been represented here. Now, if we follow recent by-election results, as I explained, the PA and other parties seem to be drawing whatever colored support there is for the ANC away from that party and towards the PA. And there's also been quite a bit of momentum for Action SA when it comes to black voters. So ultimately, it does seem as if there is a steady trickle of black voters who who are leaning towards parties closer to the center, as well as certain minorities who've continued to vote for parties such as the ANC, which are finally turning away from them. What's even more encouraging for the traditional opposition to the RET bloc is voter turnout. Following the 2024 election, elections analyst Davy Schultz released some very interesting data. One of the pieces of data that he released was voter turnout by race. So if we take a look at his X post over here, we see that white voter turnout was at 71%, making it the highest voter turnout out of all the racial groups. This was a 6% decline from the previous election. We then saw Indian voter turnout at 64%, which is a 5% decline from the previous election, followed by colored voter turnout at 58%, another 5% decline from the previous election. And then at the very bottom, we saw black voter turnout at 55%, which was an 8% decline from the previous election. And so we do see a very worrying statistic where South Africans of all backgrounds seem to be becoming increasingly disenfranchised with the political system. Still, this trend heavily favors parties such as the DA, Freedom Front Plus, PA, and other centrist to right-leaning parties, because these parties greatly rely on minority voters. And as we can see from this data, not only are all of the minority voters turning out at higher percentages than black voters when it comes to election day, but the decline in black voter turnout is much larger than it is for other racial groups. And so again, this is another statistic which does not fare well for the RET bloc and is really testament to how many black voters do not believe in the ANC and its policies, as well as like-minded parties for that matter. Still, the only way that the South African political system will fundamentally change is if parties in the center and to the right learn how to resonate with these disenfranchised voters who no longer turn up at the polls. It is only then that they will be able to swing support heavily in their favor and truly make a difference. Thank you very much for tuning into this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen, and this is the Power Pod.